Hey guys, it's me, Mr. Ferreter, and let's talk for a second about a landform that you may not have heard a whole lot about before, called estuaries. Think for a second, what do you know about estuaries, scale of 1 to 5? 5 means you've lived in an estuary before, and 0 means I haven't ever really even heard of that word before. Okay, so if you're anything like most people, you probably haven't heard a whole heck of a lot about estuaries before, but they happen to be one of the most important landforms on Earth. So an estuary occurs any place where a river meets the sea. So if you understand how rivers work, they're always flowing towards the sea. And gradually, as they get closer and closer and closer to the sea, the rivers get bigger and bigger and bigger. That's something that we're going to talk about later on during the course of our unit. Well, eventually the fresh water flowing from the rivers meets the salt water of the sea, and that place where that happens is called an estuary. Here's an example of an estuary. This is from California. It's an estuary in California. Do you see those rivers that are flowing their way to the sea in the upper left-hand corner? Okay, that's exactly what an estuary is, and that's exactly where you're going to find estuaries. Now, an estuary is super important. And here's the reason why it's so important. One of the things that estuaries do is they trap nutrients and sediment that are carried by the rivers to the ocean. Well, those get trapped inside the estuary. And also, nutrients that are in the ocean and carried to the shore by the tides are also trapped inside of an estuary. So you end up with this really rich area where there's lots of nutrients available. Well, the result of having lots of nutrients available is you also end up with lots of plant and animal life inside of an estuary. I mean, if we go back and look at that particular picture, do you see how green and lush and fertile it all looks? Well, that's not by mistake. There's lots of nutrients that are there that are being trapped by the rivers or deposited by the rivers as they flow to the sea and that are being carried in from the ocean by the tides. It's really rich and fertile area. And the result is lots and lots of plants and animals live in estuaries. Now, estuaries are important for a few other reasons as well. One of the things that's important to know about estuaries is that the water tends to be very shallow in an estuary, which means that sunlight can penetrate the water very well, which means you're going to get lots of plant growth in an estuary. If the water was super deep, remember that sunlight can only kind of make its way through the first few feet of water. And so if estuaries were really deep, you'd have less plant life because there'd be less sunlight making it to the bottom of the estuary. The other thing that's important to know about estuaries is that because they're such a fertile area, you have lots of species that are both ocean and river species that make the estuary sort of their home for hatchlings. So those animals will go and give birth inside of an estuary because it's sort of a healthy, protected environment that they can lay their eggs in or that they can have their babies in before those babies then have to go off and survive in whatever their normal habitat happens to be. Now, estuaries aren't just fertile places for plants to grow and for animals to have their babies. That's not the only reason why estuaries are important. Estuaries also help to control erosion and reduce flooding because they're wide open spaces. If you have really high river flows at any given time, that water can spread itself out across the estuary. Does that make sense to you? So if there wasn't a wide estuary area at the end of a river, then as water levels rose, the water would have nowhere to go, and that would cause erosion and flooding on the mainland. But because the estuary is sort of this wide, spread out area, that water, even if the water levels rise, that water is able to spread out, which helps to prevent flooding further upriver. That's kind of interesting, isn't it? Another thing that estuaries help to do is they protect the shore from waves. So if there's huge heavy waves that are out in the ocean coming towards land that would normally crash into the land and create more erosion and damage the shoreline, estuaries sort of act like a buffer, and they absorb some of those wave energies. As the waves come into the estuary, the energy is released and dispersed across that big, broad area. Okay, and the very last thing that they help to do is they soak up heavy rains at the shore. So if there's lots of heavy rain, or if there's a huge storm surge where the water levels rise in the oceans, then that can be absorbed by the estuary. In some ways, that estuary is acting like a buffer between the river and the ocean. And so as the ocean sends its energy towards shore, that energy can be dispersed across the entire estuary. As the rivers send their energy towards the ocean, or their water towards the ocean, that water can be dispersed across the entire area of the estuary. It acts like a nice buffer that prevents damage from water happening in either direction. And here's another benefit that we get from estuaries. They actually act like a filter for nature. Here's what I mean by that. Do you think it's likely that rivers carry some pollution with them from their source to the ocean? Well, yeah, of course they do, right? Like all along the river, there's opportunities for pollution to end up in the river. Well, when that pollution hits the estuary, oftentimes it is settled out into the sediment at the bottom of the estuary. So those pollutants are taken from the water, filtered through the water, and trapped into the sediments and soils of the estuary before they hit the ocean. I think that's really important to know, right? Like, we wouldn't want pollution from the surface of the earth to get into our oceans. It would cause lots of damage. Well, how do you filter pollutants out of a river? You do it through your estuary. When the water arrives in the estuary, the pollutants are filtered into the soil. Estuaries also have some animals that help with that too. Oysters are really common in estuaries. And as shocking as it may seem to you, just one oyster filters 25 gallons of water every single day. So it takes water in and it shoots the water back out. And in the process of doing that, it filters the pollutants out of the water. That amazes me to think about the fact that oysters are really nature's filter. Sort of like that filter you have on your sink at your house that's cleaning the water before it gets into your cup. Oysters, which are found in estuaries, are filtering river water before it ends up inside of our oceans, which I think is super, super cool. And then last but not least, you've got lots of bacteria inside of estuaries, and those bacteria are helping to also decompose the matter that's being deposited inside of the estuary too. And the advantage of that is if you've got that bacteria filtering matter that's being deposited inside of the estuary, then again, those pollutants don't end up inside of the ocean. Okay, so the last thing to know about estuaries is if too many toxins build up inside of an estuary, that can cause lots and lots of problems for nature too. So even though estuaries do a great job of filtering pollutants for us before they reach the ocean, we've got to make sure that we don't overdo it. So we can't just say, well, the estuary will filter out the pollution. There's no need to worry about how much pollution ends up in a river. We should be concerned about that because at any given point, an estuary could become too toxic after filtering out all of the pollutants that are in the rivers that feed their way through the estuary. In the end, though, how amazing is that landform that you probably have never heard of before, right? Like scale of 1 to 5, you were probably a 1 or a 2 when it came to understanding what estuaries were and how they work. And now you can see that they provide lots of nutrients. It's a nutrient-rich area. That allows lots of plant and animal life and diversity, including becoming like a home for hatchlings. So nature or animals that live in rivers and in oceans will oftentimes give birth in estuaries because it's a fertile area for their young to start their lives. That's super cool. It acts like a buffer from the ocean's waves. It will provide like some place for lots of excess water to go. So and that helps to prevent flooding on shore, either during rainstorms or from high rivers. And then last but not least, it's nature's filter. It's taking pollutants out of river water before it gets to oceans. That one landform does a ton to help maintain the health of our overall ecosystem. I think that's worth knowing.